Well, hello there. You're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. Time then to see what's making the headlines with the chief leader writer of The Observer, Sonia Sodha, and the deputy editor of Conservative Home, Henry Hill. And welcome to both of you. So front pages then, let us start with the Daily Mail. Boris's Partygate accuser faces his own police probe, reads the front of the Mail, amid reports that a formal probe has been launched into a birthday drinks bash held for Sir Bernard Jenkins' wife. The Metro has interviewed the first baby born out of the NHS, who says we must cherish the health service as it celebrates its 75th anniversary tomorrow. Cheaper food on the way as a price war finally hots up, reads the front of the Daily Express as it looks at supermarket inflation. The front of the Guardian looks at the government's plans for global warming with the headline, UK ready to drop an £11.6 billion pledge for a climate fund. The US pushes for von der Leyen to be the next NATO chief, reads the headline in the Daily Telegraph, as they report that Ben Wallace's candidacy has been blocked. The Financial Times leading with the Bank of England, looking at contentious plans to force more international banks to set up subsidiaries in the UK. And the front page of the Daily Mirror has what they say is an exclusive interview with the broadcaster Fiona Phillips, speaking about her own Alzheimer's diagnosis. And the Star looks at the influence of popular television shows on politics. Well, a quick reminder, by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you listen to our guests. So let's head straight to them and head to Sonia Sodha and Henry Hill. Henry, why don't you kick off for us then? Daily Mail front page, a couple of Partygate probes by the police. They've picked up on one for Sir Bernard Jenkins, who we saw in action today, of course. What do you make of their response to this news?
So this is catnip to Boris Johnson's supporters. Bernard Jenkins was one of the senior Conservatives on the Privileges Committee that delivered that damning report into Boris Johnson over Partygate and eventually precipitated his departure from the House of Commons. And now the police are investigating an allegedly lockdown-breaking party held by Sir Bernard to celebrate his wife's birthday. Now, obviously, we don't want to prejudge this investigation. We don't know what's going to happen. But Sir Bernard's reappearance at the Privileges Committee has been his first public outing in a little while. He's been accused of going to ground for several weeks and sort of keeping a low media profile. So it definitely, obviously, is going to be very uncomfortable for him personally, but it is also unhelpfully going to give succor to Boris Johnson's most committed supporters who are just on a warpath and out to damage as many people as they can.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting, isn't it, that Boris Johnson's team still feel the need to do that, even though he has exited stage left. The other one, of course, is the mingle-jingle, Conservative HQ party. Who does that implicate? The former candidate for London Mayor who's about to be a peer. I mean, there's all sorts of questions that continue, Sonia.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are two events that the Met Police have reopened investigations into. One is this party it's alleged to have taken place in Parliament that Bernard Jenkins was allegedly at. But the second is, of course, and this is what The Guardian focuses on, a party in Conservative Party headquarters. We already had some photographs from this party, but in the last few weeks, an actual video has emerged. It's proved extremely controversial because the former Tory mayoral candidate, Sean Bailey, was at that party, and he was awarded a peerage in Boris Johnson's recent resignation honours. There's also someone there who was awarded an OBE, and Sean Bailey's former campaign chief is now running the campaign of another Tory hopeful to be London mayor. So these are people still very much involved in Conservative politics, and the Met Police have said that they're reopening the investigation into this event as well, that the video provides further evidence. The Met Police have apparently got some criteria that they apply to events retrospectively from during the pandemic. There's got to be sort of significant evidence of wrongdoing, flaunting of the rules, and they say this video provides that evidence that they need. What's also interesting is that they've also said that they aren't yet reopening, or opening, I should say, an investigation into alleged wrongdoing at Chequers by Boris Johnson and Carrie Johnson. They say they don't have enough evidence to open an investigation into that.
Yes, all 16 of them, as The Guardian points out. It also makes the front page there too, involving, as you said, Boris Johnson, his wife Carrie, and close friends at Downing Street and Chequers between June 2020 and May 2021. And Henry, while we're on Boris Johnson, and in fact the peerages question, that was something that was put to Rishi Sunak at the liaison committee of select committee heads today. He was asked specifically about his involvement in that list, Boris Johnson's list, and whether there are questions about it. Rishi Sunak making quite clear that he passes the list on without any intervention by him. But do you think we'll get more on that list to come out? Because it was all lost on the day that Boris Johnson, decided to quit his seat, wasn't it? Do you think we'll see further investigations into those people?
Potentially, it depends on obviously the evidence that emerges. It was one of the reasons that Boris Johnson's list was so surprising is that there were already these question marks over people like Sean Bailey, over lockdown rules, and so they've gone forward. Now it remains to be seen whether or not new allegations emerge against anyone, or whether any of the allegations that have already been aired end up getting taken forward by the police. But really, I think the extraordinary thing for Rishi Sunak is actually that he didn't intervene on Boris Johnson's resignation honours list. As someone who supports the House of Lords and think it's a valuable institution, and indeed supports the honour system, I think that this was one last example of Boris Johnson being extraordinarily reckless with the reputation of British institutions. I think it would have been perfectly reasonable for the Prime Minister to hold off on passing on that list. It is only a convention that he passes it on. Boris Johnson was obviously not Prime Minister. He can't do anything himself. It is all being governed by convention, and conventions can evolve. And instead, he's ended up in this really politically self-inflicted, damaging situation where a couple of days before the Partygate report came in and Boris Johnson finally blew up, Rishi Sunak signed off most of his resignation honours list. It was a mistake.
Well, Rishi Sunak said he was just following protocol. And that is what you have to do. Just very quickly, Henry, while we've got you, you've got the finger on the pulse, if you like, of the Tory membership. How do they feel now about Boris Johnson, and how do they feel Rishi Sunak is doing? Because it's, you saw today on his face on the liaison committee, it's not an easy job at times, and certainly not at the moment.
It's definitely not an easy job. So Rishi Sunak, Rishi Sunak is not polling well with Conservative Party activists. In our monthly cabinet league table, which we published this morning, he had a negative score, but then so did 8 other people who either are members of the cabinet or have the right to attend cabinet, so he wasn't alone. It's not all entirely down to Rishi. I think he's kind of the recipient as well of just bone-deep frustration by Conservative activists that has built up over the Johnson premiership and the Truss premiership, I guess we can still call it that, about the lack of progress that's been made on various Conservative goals. But absolutely, he is struggling. As for Boris Johnson, he still has his hardcore of committed supporters. But when we ran recent questions on Boris Johnson, support for him returning to Parliament as a Conservative candidate, it is still there, but it's going down. I think there's a recognition that his time has passed.
OK, well, more difficulties for the Prime Minister, more controversy too. If we look at the lead story for The Guardian, Sonia, the government, they say, is drawing up plans to drop the UK's flagship £11.6 billion climate and nature funding pledge, as the Prime Minister is accused of betraying populations vulnerable to global heating. So what is the pledge, and how significant is this?
So this pledge it's a 5-year pledge, 5-year commitment that the UK has made to spend 11.6 billion between 2021 and 2026. It's a contribution to a global fund that is aimed at tackling climate change around the world, particularly amongst less affluent nations, and protecting nature and wildlife, for example, protecting forestry. Now, the UK's always been seen as a global leader on these sorts of commitments, but The Guardian is reporting this evening news of an internal memo between government departments where essentially this memo sets out the reasons for why this 11.6 billion is going to be difficult to meet. I think it's incredibly worrying and also massively self-defeating. We know that climate change is increasingly going to drive migration movements across the globe as more and more people aren't able to inhabit where they live anymore as a result of sort of catastrophic changes in the climate. And this fund is something that's aimed at helping to reduce the impacts of global heating worldwide, really, but particularly helping less affluent nations reduce their carbon emissions. So it's a really, really important initiative, and I think for the UK to renege would be very, very worrying indeed. And when you think about it, 11.6 billion over 5 years, in the grand scale of government spending, it really isn't that much.
I mean, yes, the Guardian pointing out that the problem is that help for Ukraine falls within the aid budget, so it's almost impossible to meet these targets. And of course, it was a political, some might say, decision to cut the aid budget of the UK, Henry.
Yeah, the government cut it from 0.7 to 0.5% of GDP on account of they said the enormous pressure on the public finances, and ultimately that's a move that consistently, I think, polls well, at least with Conservative voters, but it does leave them with this problem. This is also an example of classic Treasury thinking, right? You make this big commitment, and then you say that actually you're going to spend most of the money in the next financial period, in the next 5-year spending round, right? You'll spend a little bit of money now, but you'll definitely spend the rest of the money later, and then things get tight and the money gets cut. This happens in British spending and across departments all the time. It's one of the biggest problems with the way that the British government handles money in general. It's one of the reasons that HS2 is so expensive, is because everything is shunted into the future in order to keep the 5-year spending within the Treasury's limits. So this is a deeply unfortunate development. It seems like it's been entirely predictable, given that we know the government has known what it's spending on Ukraine. It's known that it slashed the headline budget. The FCDO will have known the financial implications of this. So they should have seen it coming, but this is not a problem that's unique to aid. It is not a problem that's unique to this. It is just a symptom of how badly the Treasury manages government budgets.
Well, staying with environmental issues with financial implications to the ULEZ story, inside pages of the Metro, the London Mayor Sadiq Khan lacks the legal power to expand the capital's ultra-low emission zone. This is the Tory-led councils surrounding London who've brought this case. Sonia.
So this is shaping up to be a big legal fight between Sadiq Khan on the one hand, who wants to expand the £12.50 a day charge for vehicles that don't meet the standards for the ultra-low emission zones. So cars, etc., would have to pay £12.50 a day, and he wants to extend that zone to the whole of Greater London, so it would cover every London borough. And there are a number of Conservative-run councils on the outskirts of London, places like Bromley, for example, that are challenging that decision and taking him to court as to whether he's got the legal power to do that. And I think it remains to be seen what the outcome of that court battle is, but the issues at stake are really, really important. So on the one hand, you've got the fact that, we've got really terrible air pollution in London. We breach kind of legal limits. We know it's associated with illness and deaths, for example, in children with asthma. And, it's really important that we take action, quite urgent action, to improve the quality of air in London, because it really does genuinely cost lives. On the other hand, it's very unpopular, a £12.50 charge for polluting vehicles. And what the Conservative councils are saying is that some people can't afford to either pay that charge or switch to a cleaner vehicle. My feeling is that it's a sort of necessary evil, really. We've got to find a way of bringing air pollution in London down. But this is really turning into a legal fight about what are the powers of the mayor. Does he have the powers to impose this?
Haven't got time for a full answer, but thumbs up or thumbs down for this policy, Henry?
I live in central London and use public transport all the time. So from my perspective, it's obviously fine. But if you live in one of the outer boroughs of London and your life much more resembles that of a town where you use your car all the time, I can see why this might be very challenging.
Lots of news about supermarkets this week. Daily Express suggests that supermarkets are waging a war to drive down prices on food. Sonia.
Yes, this is right. So apparently Sainsbury's has announced that it's reducing the prices of 100 of its sort of key products. And it says that it thinks that this is the start of hopefully falling price inflation, which I think news of which would come as a huge relief to people up and down the country who are really struggling with bills as a result of higher energy prices, higher mortgage rates and rents, and of course higher food prices. But this is just the sort of first sign that food prices might eventually start to fall. I think we're a long way from knowing that that's a dead cert. So I think we should be cautious before doing too much celebrating yet.
Let's move on, shall we, to the Metro. Once again, news about Thames Water. After Sky News broke the news last week about their financial difficulties after the exit of their chief executive, Henry, this time fined £3.3 million after a sewage spill killed more than 1,000 fish and turned rivers black. And the Metro is suggesting the company deliberately attempted to cover up the discharge of millions of litres of waste into waterways close to Gatwick Airport. Part of a court hearing. And this, of course, comes amid great angst amongst British people about the sewage discharges that we're seeing.
Yeah, just in case there were sort of 5 people left in the country who thought that Thames Water were doing a good job, here we have handily a second story from the past to remind us that, in fact, they've been terrible for ages. It is remarkable. There's not much detail in the Metro about the allegations that they misled the Environment Agency and tried to cover it up. But when you read the rest of the story, you can see why they might, right? Apparently, when this overspill happened, there were no alarms in place to alert staff that there was an overspill and that all of this water was being discharged into the river network. When they finally did discover that there was a problem, they couldn't get in touch with the lead engineer because the lead engineer was awaiting delivery of a new mobile phone and no one had thought to give them one in the interim just in case they needed to do their job. It's just absolutely remarkable when you think about the fact that apparently this is what causes an awful lot of these issues. You know, sometimes there are, water companies can't be blamed for everything. This country is still running largely on Victorian water infrastructure and we don't build things like reservoirs and so on. But ultimately, so many of these leaks, which cause huge environmental damage and also prevent people from enjoying rivers, swimming at the beach and stuff like that, really important stuff, are down to basic failures of systems, the failure to have an alarm, the failure to make sure you can contact your staff in good time. It's not a surprise that they tried to mislead the Environment Agency, if that's what they did. But yeah, they've been caught and put in the dock.
I mean, it sounds horrifying, doesn't it? The litany of mistakes that were made there. The Metro pointing out the company has 20 previous fines for pollution. The judge in this case ordering bosses to put in every effort into tidying up the problem areas. But it feels like Britain's going backwards on this. Blue flag beaches, we celebrated each and every one over several decades, Sonia, and here we are, back to square one on this, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Henry is absolutely right that, we've got big issues with our infrastructure around water. But I think the way that the industry was privatised is very much part of that issue. So we've had these privatised, essentially, firms come in that run monopolies over water in their local area. They've had too few incentives to invest in upgrading that sort of Victorian infrastructure. And there's been a lot of private equity investment and private equity investors who've extracted out profits without making those investments. And now we've got Thames Water, a firm that's loaded up with debt, on the brink of collapse, while its private equity owners have extracted out value from the company at the expense of bill payers, which is just really, really wrong.
Sonia, I'm going to stay with you, if you don't mind, for the front of the Daily Mirror, which is shattering news to all her fans. Fiona Phillips revealing that she has Alzheimer's, which has utterly ravaged her family, being diagnosed a year ago at just the age of 61. So we certainly sent her, all our very best, don't we?
Absolutely. And I always think it's so brave when people speak out publicly about a diagnosis to sort of help share information about it. Fiona Phillips, she's a well-loved former GMTV presenter. She's a columnist for The Mirror. Very sadly, Alzheimer's took the life of both her mother and her father. They've both passed away from the disease. And one of the things that she says in her interview was she, feared that she might get the diagnosis, but she thought it might happen to her when she was around 80. And obviously, she received the diagnosis relatively young, when she was 61. There is some hope in this story, though, because she is part of a trial of a new Alzheimer's drug, which doctors and experts hope will slow the progress of the disease. But it's just such a cruel disease. Anyone who's seen a loved one go through it, because, it leaves somebody physically intact, but it removes their personality and who they are, their memories. And so to watch a loved one go through it is really, really traumatic. And I think it's very brave of her to talk about it openly after it's clearly, had such a big impact on her family.
Yes, my own father succumbed after 15 years with Alzheimer's. So, I fully understand. As she said, her mum, her dad, her grandparents and her uncle, it just keeps coming back for us. So, huge sympathy, certainly for Fiona Phillips and her family.